Voice America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to talk about this very good piece that came out in American Thinker, Trump's Good Enough Strategy, which I think, first of all, will help those of you that have been watching all of the almost incredible turbulence during the second administration under Donald Trump. It also has some great application to the business world and great application to your own personal life. I think you will find it quite interesting, and it is written by one of the other young voices. We have been very fortunate over these last couple of months to have various articulate voices that are contributors to what are called the Young Voices Group. And this one is Sam Raus, who is the David Boaz Resident Writing Fellow in that particular area where he is working. He's a nationally published political analyst. He is an individual that is, of course, one of the contributors to Young Voices, a native of the Philadelphia metro area, which probably gives you a little bit of a hint on which football team he'll be rooting for tonight, and also a graduate of the University of Miami with a bachelor's degree in communications, majoring in public relations and political science. And Sam, welcome to Point of View.
Thank you so much, and yes, go Eagles.
I figured we got a Philadelphia Eagles fan, so there you go. Let's get into this in some detail because, again, President Donald Trump sending the National Guard out. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about even blowing up narco-terrorists coming to this country, firing various individuals, writing more executive orders than I think we've seen any president do. And you point out that in some respects that turbulence is confusing, but in some respects it is, I think, a great lesson, and that is maybe people in the business world and even some of our listeners maybe need to understand you don't sweat the small stuff. Explain that if you might.
Yeah, I think what we've seen over now the past 6 or so months of the start of this new administration is an approach to politics that is much more willing to try things out, much more willing to take decisive action and kind of trust the president's gut, trust in the unity of our elected officials and their ability to sort through problems and act and do things. And I think after many years of kind of stalling in committee hearing conversations, thinking about, well, maybe we could do this, trying to hyperanalyze everything before taking action, what we're seeing is leadership that is really decisive and really bold. And I think that is a lesson that doesn't just apply to politics, it applies to the business sector, it applies to our everyday lives, being willing to take those things that we see to be true, that we want to see happen, and start taking action on them rather than waiting and trying to weigh all the risks and benefits and try to, do it perfectly and make it, spotless, because really time moves so quickly and things evolve so fast that sometimes you have to trust your gut.
Well, again, you point out if you go to corporate America, I may quote you back a couple of lines. As a matter of fact, I'll show our listeners here. I yellow highlight a lot of what I read, and there's yellow highlights on every paragraph just about. But you talk about the fact that in corporate America, you can blow a quarter's profits and still keep your job, but a stray typo is treated like a criminal offense. And I've seen that before. If there's a theme that runs through the Trump Good Enough strategy, it is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I've been in situations, and I'm sure Donald Trump has as well, where you have to have every one of the PowerPoint slides just perfect. And if there was maybe a typo or a comma out of place, people just kind of lose their minds because they can't use a different illustration. They can't see the forest for the trees. Matter of fact, they're so involved in the limbs or the branches, they don't even see the forest. And there is a sense in which that corporate mindset has also sort of encapsulated what is happening oftentimes in Congress, whether the House or the Senate, where everything is ready, aim, Donald Trump comes in here and said, ready, fire. And there's a sense in which this is causing a lot of people a sense of anxiety, but he, after being out of the office for 4 years, had a sense to figure out what to do. And if I can use a football analogy, he decided to flood the zone. And all of this is happening simultaneously, and his critics can't seem to keep up with him because he recognizes that maybe we don't need to use this very definitely kind of micromanaging mindset that you see sometimes in corporate America.
Yeah, and I think we see this so often on the politics of the left these days. It really is ran like a management consulting company. I mean, they hyperfixate on every noun and pronoun that could be used to describe something. Their policies are rather watered down and confusing because they have to, focus group them with every single different demographic and sect of the country. And rather, the president, is not adverse to, trusting in what he believes to be true, reading the tea leaves and acting based off of what might come to mind rather quickly. He's not concerned with, he's rather used to walking down a windy tarmac and your hair might blow up, while the left is really concerned whether or not you have the right pronouns in your bio. And so I think this contrast between, look, the current Republican Party is very broad, very diverse. There's a lot of disagreement on a whole number of different issues from people that come from different perspectives. But what unites the party, what unites this administration, is some shared bedrock beliefs and their understanding that taking action now and working together is what matters most at the end of the day, not always being in perfect lockstep with one another, not always, relying so heavily on some data or some polling to make sure that something is perfect and is 100% going to move people, because I think they realize how quickly moods can shift, how something that may come across to some study is maybe not the perfect answer, can quickly change once done and people see the actual outcomes and benefits of that policy. And I think we see this consistently with some of the strong anti-crime policies being enacted, some of the strong anti-illegal immigration policies being taken that were seen as rather extreme and seen as rather unpopular before, but once done, the American people seem to stand behind them rather firmly.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into this a little bit more, because Sam refers to it as Trump's good enough strategy, or you could call it the B-plus rule. But even as we go to the break, one of the illustrations he uses of this particular company really wanting to issue an apology for the opioid epidemic, but in some respects, all you do is read through something that is a really bland sort of non-apology apology, and as you said, it's sort of public relations as performance art, creates an illusion of competence, discipline, and harmony. And that is not exactly what we see in the Oval Office. That's not exactly what we see in the press room. So we'll come back and maybe talk about the relationship between Donald Trump and Caroline Leavitt and what he is trying to do, and maybe even how this has perhaps changed the way in which politics and even government is being done, certainly the way in which this president has gone about doing it. So we'll take a break and continue our conversation on Trump's good enough strategy right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Kenneth Rogoff is a Harvard University economics professor. On an X post, he identified himself as the Harvard economist who predicted back in 2018 that a decade from now, Bitcoin is more likely to be more like $100 than $100,000. He obviously got that prediction wrong, since Bitcoin has consistently been at or above $100,000 for months. He explained his mistake by saying that he was far too optimistic about the U.S. coming to its senses about sensible crypto regulation. As a former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, he likely had no use for Bitcoin and has been surprised that it's been accepted by so many financial institutions. This includes private companies, public companies, mining companies, as well as some countries. One of those is Harvard University's endowment, which has invested approximately $117 million in Bitcoin through shares of BlackRock's iShares Bitcoin Trust. Another reason the economist predicted the fall of Bitcoin was due to his belief that government would step in to regulate or even ban Bitcoin. He even wonders why the current administration and Congress would pass something like the Genius Act when he is convinced that Bitcoin was only good for tax evasion and money laundering. One post by Dr. Jan Wistenfeld explained, "It is hard to understand something if you first have to unlearn what you've been taught and believed your whole life. This makes it hard, especially for traditionally educated economists, as Bitcoin turns the world upside down." He says the Harvard economist professor is a perfect example of that. Two important lessons here. Economics predictions by Harvard professors can be wrong, which is why we need to be open to new ideas. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, this is an article that was appeared in American Thinker, Trump's good enough strategy. And Sam, just a minute ago, I was talking about what is typical sometimes in the corporate boardrooms where you write a press release, then a half a dozen different people look at it, and pretty soon it looks like something's been a Cuisinart for about a week, and it's kind of bland, it's vanilla, but it isn't doing anything. That is hardly the Donald Trump political operation. And talk about that, because you have a situation in which, and I've been amazed at the bold pronouncements that Caroline Leavitt, the youngest press secretary ever, has made. And sometimes people attribute it to being youthful and inexperienced, but I think it really comes down to Trump trusts her, and they don't always try to get all the words that he says and she says all lined up. And in some respects, that's why this whole administration is just moving at an incredible speed, and it's really so different than anything we've seen before, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that first and foremost, trust matters, and relationships that the administration has honed with one another, the connection between the president and those who are serving him, is really important. And I think it's allowed for such rapid action and allowed for them to be pursuing their own things, be championing different goals, and they're ultimately all tied back to the president's agenda. But he gives them enough leeway to act and do things, and there's kind of this harmonious relationship there. But I think that when it comes to the messaging, when it comes to the press secretary's statements, what both she and the president seem to really understand is that tone, a little bit of emotion, truly does matter. And that's not to suggest that we need a politics endlessly filled with outrage. There's certainly times where it's much more appropriate to use a more measured tone. It's much more appropriate to be rather formal, but there's also times for a little bit of sarcasm, a little bit of jokes, a little bit of outrage, and I think channeling that emotion and channeling different energy behind things really resonates with people. When there's an issue, a certain catastrophe or event that people should be angry about, they're willing to go for it, and they're willing to express that level of outrage to people. When there's something horrific that's happening, a natural disaster, or the recent shooting we saw in Minnesota at the Catholic school, they're willing to speak with a much more measured and conciliatory tone, because it's just an instance where that should be used. So I think that being willing to balance between those, not always speaking through some sort of professionalized verbiage that uses all these vocabulary words created by McKinsey, I think really, really connects with the ordinary person and how we all speak on a day-to-day basis, how the media communicates information to us on a regular basis, and I think that's much more cohesive with how the regular world works.
And it is kind of interesting because, after all, let's face it, Donald Trump has lived in the corporate world, and yet in some respects he does a better job many times in interacting with the average everyday person. He can certainly speak the corporate world when he's in a boardroom, but when he's out there on the work site, before he was president, he oftentimes had all sorts of people that loved him that were building the buildings. And there is a sense in which part of that also requires the willingness to not care what other people think. And that is that even though he went to an Ivy League school, it really doesn't mean that much to him if somebody wants to invite him to a party or whatever, because many times he's inviting them to theirs. And even the vice president, J.D. Vance, he went to an Ivy League school too, but they recognize that if you take these stands, well, you might not necessarily get invitations. And yet many people that get elected go to Congress, and they want to be part of the inner circle, and so you see that kind of change. So the key to having a B-plus rule or a good enough strategy is being willing to say some things and know that it's maybe not perfectly honed, and it may be not even well received because it's not politically correct by the elite group, and really not care. And I think that's the other part of what's been taking place over these last couple of years in his first administration and now in his second administration.
Yeah, I think that the rejection of this kind of where you went to college, where you grew up, elitism, and much more of judging people based off of their character, based off of their performance, what they've accomplished, what they believe in, is one of the overarching themes we've seen over the past decade. I think a really under-discussed story of this election and of some of the Democrats that are now in the administration, Secretary Kennedy, Director Gabbard, and a number of others, is this idea of a lot of people that may not completely agree with the president's political agenda really grew tired of a system that was rewarding only certain people, only a certain class of people that went to an Ivy League school, that lived in small sectors of the United States, that worked in particular industries in our economy. And so they were willing to get behind somebody and get behind some of these policies now that don't 100% represent what they've always thought. They may still be unsure around the edges, but I think they've realized that it's better to trust your gut and you know, have faith in other people than to try to go along to climb up this career ladder and win over the praises of, you know, repeating the same talking points all over again. And so I think that what we'll continue to see as this administration continues is policies that then go on to uplift those people and are expanding the base to include different viewpoints, but people that are really coming from various walks of life, people that you know, did not come from the greatest economic means, people that did not go to the Ivy League schools or, you know, work on Wall Street. I think that ties actually back really to the president's background in real estate and in development and industries that you had to work with a lot of different people. You had to negotiate with local government. You had to negotiate with laborers. It wasn't, you know, exactly all boardrooms in the way that maybe some other businesses are.
Yes, and again, I love that his willingness to tolerate imperfection accelerates the pace of action. Trump bets on momentum. He trusts that moving boldly, even imperfectly, creates its own luck, and his political career is a case study in the principle: survive enough storms, and eventually the storm becomes your natural habitat. Let me just mention real quickly that, Sam, I've been following you because you have written, as a matter of fact, your most recent one in the American Thinker is Do Not Renew Renewable Fuel Standard. That is a topic, by the way, we're going to talk about tomorrow with Dr. Merle Matthews, who's kind of our energy expert. You call it Do Not Renew This Nonsense Standard. You wrote one for the American Spectator on steel manning tariffs. We're going to be talking about that tomorrow, part of our roundtable with Liberty McCarter, Dr. Matthews, and myself on the whole issue of tariffs. And you've written on a variety of other topics, and one of which is the high cost of pharmacy. And, of course, Dr. Matthews, probably even better known for an individual who's quite the expert on medical issues. So we need to get you involved involved in some of the things that we do, whether it is the Friday weekend edition or our Next Generation Roundtable, because as I've been able to follow some of the writing that you've done on all sorts of other issues, and I didn't even mention TikTok and artificial intelligence, I think you would certainly provide quite a bit to us. So, first of all, I want to say thank you for joining us today. Thank you for writing this article on American Thinker. Maybe in the future we can get into some of those other writings that you've done, and appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me. And for your listeners, you can follow me on X at Sam Raus1. And stay tuned for more. I would love to come back.
Might mention that we do have right next to you the link to X, and if you want to make some comments about the Philadelphia Eagles, you can do that too. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we have some things to talk about. Too many kids aren't going back to school, the whole issue of trans athletes, and a couple other issues that I've postponed to the last half hour. So all of that is available, but if you wanted to find a link to Sam, we have that link there as well, and it's very easy to find so that you don't have to remember how he said it. And if you want to connect up with the Christian Businessmen's Connection, that's still on the website. Articles by everybody from Mark Penn to William Galston. And, of course, we'll also talk about Malcolm Gladwell, all sorts of issues on the website today. Scroll down on the right-hand side. You'll see the highlights for Point of View on Spotify. You'll see the Veritas registration. You'll see my Viewpoints commentary today. So lots of ways in which you can connect up with us. We want to give you news, information, commentary that you can put to good use. And certainly each day we seem to highlight some other great voices that you need to hear from. And one of those is Sam Raus, who is, again, a writer with the Young Voices organization. Let's take a break, though. We will come back in this last half hour to cover a couple more issues. And then don't forget our Friday weekend edition. I've already given you a preview to what we'll be talking about. So stay tuned. We'll have more right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour, let's we can spend just a little bit of time talking again about education. Since many I guess all kids are finally in school. I remember a couple of weeks ago when I was talking about, we're back to school, and some of the people in the West Coast are saying, we don't go to school till after Labor Day, so stop talking about being in school when it's only August. Well, it just depends on what part of the country you are located in, but I think now we can honestly say everybody's in school, but unfortunately not all. And William Galston, who is an individual I quote from time to time, who again was kind of the deputy policy advisor under former our President Bill Clinton has been writing a lot of very good articles, and I always want to look for common sense. Doesn't matter whether you have an R or a D next to your name. Common sense is common sense, and it's, again, maybe just illustrative of something we talked about a few minutes ago with Mark Penn, who maybe they're writing some of these articles to simply say, these are the issues we fellow Democrats should be focused on instead of orange man bad. But nevertheless, let's give credit where credit is due. William Galston says too many kids aren't going back to school. Now, I will add a disclaimer. One of the problems is when you look at these numbers, I do know that certain states don't count homeschool as effectively as they should. So when you are talking about the issue of chronic absenteeism, most of the time it is talking about individuals who are registered to school but are not going to school. That's very different, and you and I would certainly agree, of individuals who are not in school at all because they're being homeschooled or they've gone to a charter school or a classical Christian school or something like that. So primarily what we're talking about here is something, but I know in your back of your mind you might be thinking that, so I wanted to recognize that if individuals are not in school, they may actually be getting a very good education. Okay, so once we got that out of the way, then William Galston puts it this way. Students are flocking back to school. Well, most of them. Too many aren't. The Education Department defines chronic absenteeism as missing at least 10% of a school year, or about 18 days. It's associated, and he gives you then some links, and of course makes sense, here's common sense, to poor educational outcomes, both who miss classes and then for the regular attendees whose teachers must spend time helping absentees catch up. When students who miss classes have pre-existing behavioral conditions, these issues tend to be worse when they return. Sort of makes sense. In line with common sense, recent research shows that the more days a student misses school, the more negative the effect on his academic performance. Now, let's go back to pre-pandemic. In the 2 years before the pandemic, national rates for chronic absenteeism stood at about 15%, a level widely regarded even then as a crisis. Post-pandemic, that rate has nearly doubled. The best number I can come up with is 28.5%, but that was for 2022. If it's been increasing, it probably is twice. Could be at 30%. Just think about that for a minute. 30%. Now, I recognize it's not uniform across the board. In some places, especially in inner cities, it may be much higher, which is even sadder because it could be like 50% of the class is not there, because in some of the more suburban schools, it may only be 10%. But you see the problem, and I think he's identified a very significant one. And he says, like many Americans, I made the assumption about school attendance, called like the fire drill model. We told kids and students to stay away from school when the pandemic raged, and they did, but we assumed that then when they were told to come back, they would, kind of like a fire drill. It didn't happen. Didn't work out that way. After 2022, the rate of chronic absenteeism remained high. And then he now quotes from one of the colleagues that he has, Nate Malkus, who is with the American Enterprise Institute. He says, with few exceptions, chronic absenteeism rose at similar rates in most states and school districts. When this individual at the American Enterprise Institute researched it and compared low achievement schools and high achievement schools, as well as schools of different size and locations, he found the increase as a share of the pre-pandemic baseline had been similar. So even though I a minute ago tried to discount the possibility that if you're talking about 30% of the class, then maybe it's only 10% in really good schools and maybe 50% in bad schools, the reality is it is pretty much across the board, and that's of concern. Well, you might say, well, maybe that has to do with race and ethnicity. No, not necessarily, because they did the research there. And between 2020 and 2022, chronic absenteeism more than doubled for white, black, and Hispanic students. So this is getting to be kind of a chronic problem, and it doesn't just necessarily break out in terms of high achievement, low achievement schools, rich and poor, white, black, Hispanic. It seems to be everywhere. Then he tries to answer, and I think this is still the big question, why do we have such chronic absenteeism and why is it so high? Well, the researchers aren't sure, but reasonable hypotheses have emerged. He says the pandemic was a shock to society, and many underestimate its continued effects. It disrupted long-established patterns of behavior, including the habit of getting up and going to school every weekday. And so if you didn't have to get up during the pandemic, maybe parents are a little less inclined to get Johnny out of bed. That's certainly a possibility. It's quite possible that if mom and dad aren't having to go to the office, they're not getting out of bed right away. And so the whole disruption is happening in the home, and it's affecting the schools. And then, of course, you have during the pandemic, something we just talked about a while back, as we were talking with our friend Matthew Traylor, the children, the adolescents, even the parents, were physically isolated from one another, connected only by their cell phones. This, of course, had an impact on the mental health, which we've talked about so many times. And I was in a meeting just this morning where we once again quoted the book, The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt's been on the program before. He goes on to say, then, while the causes of chronic absenteeism aren't all certain, one thing is clear. This is a national problem. The United States will pay a high price until it gets it under control. So again, it's still, we are seeing that there is a recent what is called Attendance Works report showing that some states now use data to assess progress on chronic absenteeism and trying to enhance accountability. And so they're looking at some possible changes that might be in the offing, that might be working, but nevertheless, that is still the case. But he goes on to say that we still have a long way to go. 43% of students attended schools in districts that weren't on track to reduce chronic absenteeism by 50% by 2027. So there's still more that some of these schools and school districts need to do. And we're going to be very soon in an election season again. And I think it's important that if you have somebody saying that they want to run for school board, or you have found out that there is a new administrator or principal at your public school, you might ask them, what are they doing about this issue of chronic absenteeism? And he goes on to simply say that the longer chronic absenteeism persists, the more students will experience poor academic outcomes, reducing their economic prospects, and diminishing the quality of their personal and social lives. It will take engaged parents, civil society organizations, government officials, and school leaders working together to fill empty seats at school. Again, I haven't heard too many people talking about that, so let's give credit to William Galston, who has pulled together some of the material that is at the American Enterprise Institute, and that research once again illustrates that we have too many kids, as he says, that aren't going back to school. Come back from the break, I want to just talk real briefly about something that affected Malcolm Gladwell. You know him for writing a lot of great books, but The Tipping Point. So I chose to call this The Tipping Point and Trans Athletes, because it was a reminder that here, even for the interview that he did with Ross Tucker and Malcolm Gladwell, and I'll explain who they are in just a minute, that indeed it was even not as recently as even like a year or two ago, not politically correct and not acceptable to even suggest that we shouldn't have men competing in women's sports. We've seen a lot of shift. Some of that is due to Donald Trump. Some of it's due to just common sense breaking out all over. So we'll talk about that. But I thought we'd wind down also by maybe some comments about prayer. As you well know, as you scroll down our website, we have a link to Pray for America. And I thought we might just mention the fact that prayer has been criticized a lot these last few weeks ever since the shooting in Minneapolis. So I thought I'd end with some positive comments from presidents and even the founders of this country. We'll be right back.
listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Malcolm Gladwell is an individual that is just a fascinating individual that writes for New Yorker and is the author of a number of books. The Tipping Point is one that I've quoted in terms of the title, but Outliers, Blink, David and Goliath. If you haven't seen his TED Talk on David and Goliath, fascinating, and so brings a lot to the table. As an individual that is from Canada and was University of Toronto and a number of other places, Trinity University, but nevertheless has been able to coin phrases, tipping point and things like that he uses, and introduce concepts sometimes that are locked away in academic volumes like in psychology, sociology, brings them into the popular culture. And I might just point out, he actually got his start at American Spectator. And just a minute ago, I was talking about Sam Raus had one of his articles in American Spectator. So, and by the way, I have a subscription to American Spectator, but as I think Steve knows, I have a subscription to a lot of things, which makes it easier for me to give you information. But nevertheless, let's go to Malcolm Gladwell because I thought it was interesting. He was on a program which is like a podcast called The Real Science of Sport. And it's a sports scientist, Professor Ross Tucker. And they talked about when they were at a conference which was held, it's called the Sloan Conference, held every year at MIT in Boston. And it was really a stacked conference, not unlike ones I found myself in over the years, because it all had to do with the issue of transgenderism, and it illustrates again how there was an inability to really even try to inject common sense into a place like MIT. Okay, let's introduce the panel. Malcolm Gladwell was the moderator. And then he says, really, Ross, it was stacked against you because you have Ross Tucker, who I'm sure indeed was against the idea of men competing with women in sports. But then they had a trans athlete and then a trans advocate. And then Malcolm was the moderator. Well, you know where this went. Any time that Ross Tucker would bring out an issue, the audience was quiet or maybe even disdaining. And then as soon as the particular individual who was a trans athlete spoke, well, then they applauded. And they said one of the turning points for them in terms of the debate was when the trans athlete at one point turned to Ross and said, Ross, you're just going to have to let us win. And it began to be very obvious that the trans movement was not asking for a place at the table. They were not asking to be treated with respect and dignity. They were asking for no one to question the physiological, maybe even psychological advantage that a man brings to the sport, and that you weren't allowed to question it. And if the women lose by 5 seconds, well, as he says, suck it up, because that's what was going on. And so they saw that the particular issue should have been done differently. And as somebody that's moderated debates, I would like to believe that in that circumstance, I would have said, oh, wait a minute. I know everybody's cheering right now, but I think we need to inject some common sense, But Malcolm Gladwell basically said, I was just cowed into going along with that. And that's what has been happening over these last few years. And that's finally changed because they, at the end of this piece that I've posted for you, admit that finally the conversation is changing and the argument was evolving. And so this idea that, well, you just have to accept it, that wasn't going to work out very well. And eventually we brought a little bit more of common sense back to the conversation. And I just think it's a good illustration of somebody who certainly is well known. Malcolm Gladwell probably is not concerned whether or not his next book would be a best-selling book. It will be. But in this particular case, unlike, as we mentioned just yesterday, J.D. Rowling actually was willing to endure a lot of criticism and a lot of concern and a lot of attacks because she was willing to speak out on those issues. But Malcolm Gladwell instead said, I must admit, I was really cowed by the audience and by the set of circumstances and by what was politically correct. So I thought, if nothing else, we might remind you that fortunately some things have changed. And essentially, Malcolm Gladwell in this piece is sort of apologizing that he didn't speak up at the time and at least provide some aid and comfort to Ross Tucker as he was outmatched and outmanned and put into a very difficult situation, first by the panelists and then by the audience. But it's something to think about as we are starting to see common sense eventually coming back to the fore. But I thought we might end with this whole idea of prayer, because over the last couple of weeks, of course, we've seen how people have reacted to the shooter in Minneapolis at that Catholic church school. And Gary Bauer the other day put it this way, Satan wrote the script for the atrocities that transpired at the Minneapolis Catholic school and church. The transgender message was, "Where's your God now?" He wasn't referring to Allah. He was referring to the God of the Bible, the God of Catholics, Jews, and Protestants, the one that we worship. The only God, by the way. Where your God now was Satan mocking God. And if that was not bad enough, we had one person after another criticize prayer. The mayor of Minneapolis said these kids were praying, so what good did prayer do? Jen Psaki was talking about the fact that prayer is not freaking enough, she says. Prayers do not end school shootings. Enough with thoughts and prayers. You have one representative from Florida, I don't give whatever for your thoughts and prayers. And I thought it would be good to remind us that back in 1984, I remember I was at the Republican National Convention right here in Dallas. I was writing columns as a syndicated columnist. And Ronald Reagan, interestingly enough, gave a speech at the Dallas prayer meeting before he spoke to the nation at the Republican convention. And he said, "We establish no religion in this country, nor will we ever. We command no worship. We mandate no belief. But we poison our society when we remove its theological underpinnings. We court corruption when we leave it bereft of belief. All are free to believe or not to believe. All are free to practice faith or not. But those who believe must be free to speak of and act on their belief to apply moral teachings to public questions." A little bit later he says, "Without God there is no virtue, because there's no prompting of the conscience. Without God, we're mired in the material, we're flat world that tells us only what the senses perceive. Without God, there is a coarsening of society, and without God, democracy will not and cannot long endure. If we ever forget that we're one nation under God, then we'll be a nation gone under." And George Washington reminded us in his farewell address that national morality will not be able to prevail in exclusion of religious principle. And even an individual who was hardly a Christian, Thomas Jefferson, said, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever." So there is certainly a biblical foundation to this country, as you will be receiving, if you are one of our donors, our new booklet on One Nation Under God. I also encourage you to go to our website at pointofview.net and click on that button that allows you to receive our emails on Prayer for America. One last time, let me again thank both Megans for engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. I hope you join us tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition right here on Point of View.
Picture someone in your life, if you can, who needs the truth. Have you ever wished that you could point that person to resources that would help them? Maybe they're buying into mainstream media lies, and you wish you could easily share information providing a more full picture. Or maybe they're questioning their faith. They need devotionals and testimonies, resources they identify with. Maybe they're navigating parenting in this modern era. They need insight on handling new technology and mental health crises and everything in between. When you support Point of View, you provide resources just like these to people who need the truth. The best way to support Point of View is by joining the Truth Team. I invite you to learn more about the Truth Team by visiting us online at pointofview.net. Or you can learn by calling toll-free 1-800-347-5151. The Truth Team, pointofview.net, and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.